What would you do if a simple request for kindness turned into a moment of public humiliation? Or what if a 13-year-old girl, traveling alone, was denied the basic comfort of a blanket, not because there were none available, but because of who she was? Imagine the sting of rejection in front of strangers, the silence of those who looked away, and the weight of realizing the world still has shadows of prejudice at 30,000 feet in the sky. But what if that same silence was broken? What if one voice spoke up, then another, and suddenly the truth could not be hidden? What happens when the captain himself gets a call, and the person waiting at the gate is not just a father, but a man whose power could change everything? This is not just a story about a flight gone wrong. It is about dignity, justice, and the courage of a young girl who refused to shrink. A story that will leave you questioning, what would you have done if you were there? Before we begin, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel, because stories like this need to be told, and you don't want to miss what happens next. The terminal lights shimmered against the polished floor of Atlanta International Airport. It was just past sunrise, the kind of quiet hour where the world feels heavy with both exhaustion and anticipation. For Aaliyah Carter, 13 years old, the airport was a place of both wonder and nerves. She clutched her backpack tightly, the straps worn from use, her lucky keychain a small silver robot she had built herself dangling and clinking against the zipper. This wasn't just another trip. For Aaliyah, it was the first time she would fly alone. She wasn't just going to visit family or spend time away from home. She was headed to New York City, invited to present her robotics project at an international technology and environmental conference. For weeks, she had rehearsed her speech, checked her slides, practiced every line. And yet, the real challenge wasn't standing in front of a panel of scientists. It was making it through this airport and this flight without her father at her side. Marcus Carter, her father, walked beside her as far as security would allow. A tall man with sharp features softened by kind eyes. Marcus had spent 2 decades in the airline industry, working his way up to become a senior executive. Colleagues often described him as calm under pressure, the kind of leader who spoke with authority without ever raising his voice. But when it came to his daughter, his calmness often gave way to worry. "Remember what I told you," Marcus said, his voice low but steady, as they paused before the security line. "Keep your passport and boarding pass in your front pocket. Don't let anyone rush you. And if you feel uneasy, call me. Always call me." Aaliyah nodded, her braids swaying gently as she looked up at him. "I know, Dad. I'll be fine. It's just a 2-hour flight." He smiled, though worry lingered in his eyes. 2 hours can feel like forever if things don't go right. For a moment, silence hung between them, filled only by the shuffling of passengers in line and the distant voice of an announcer calling boarding for an earlier flight. Aaliyah reached for his hand, her small fingers wrapping around his calloused ones. "I wish you could come with me," she whispered. "I do too," Marcus replied, his throat tightening. "But you're ready, more ready than you think. And besides, I think your mom would be proud to see you doing this on your own." At the mention of her mother, Aaliyah's chest tightened. Her mother had passed away years earlier, a loss that still shaped both of their lives in quiet ways. She nodded slowly, her eyes shimmering but strong. With one last embrace, Marcus let her go, watching as his daughter slipped into the winding line toward security. He stayed, his tall figure visible behind the rope, until she passed through the checkpoint and disappeared into the crowd. Aaliyah's heart pounded as she made her way to the gate. She followed the signs, double-checked the monitors, and even practiced introducing herself in her head, what she would say if anyone asked why she was traveling alone. She didn't want to seem scared, though she was. She wanted to look like she belonged. When she reached Gate C-23, her pulse steadied. Passengers crowded the waiting area, tapping at their phones, sipping coffee, or quietly reading. The glass wall revealed the aircraft waiting outside a sleek white plane, its nose pointed proudly toward the rising sun. Flight 482 to New York. Boarding in 20 minutes. The gate agent announced over the loudspeaker. Aaliyah took a seat near the window, pulling her robot keychain into her palm. She traced its tiny arms with her thumb, remembering the hours she had spent building it, soaring wires late into the night. She had named it Hope. It wasn't just a robot. It was a reminder of where hard work and persistence could take her. As boarding began, Aaliyah joined the line, holding her boarding pass tightly. She had been upgraded to first class, something her father had arranged without telling her until that morning. "You deserve to be treated with dignity," he had said. She hadn't argued, though she worried how people might look at her sitting up front. When her turn came, she handed her pass to the gate agent with a polite smile. The scanner beeped. The agent nodded, and Aaliyah stepped down the jet bridge, her shoes squeaking softly against the carpet. The air smelled faintly metallic, the scent of recycled oxygen and engine fuel. As she entered the plane, a flight attendant stood at the door, her smile practiced, her eyes sharp. "Good morning," Aaliyah said softly. The attendant glanced at her, then at the boarding pass still in her hand. Her name tag read Rebecca Collins. For a moment, Rebecca hesitated, her brow furrowed. Then, with a tone that carried subtle disbelief, she asked. First Class Aaliyah nodded. "Yes, ma'am." Rebecca took the pass, scanned it again with her handheld device, and then looked back at the girl. "This is seat 3A. Up front, left side. Someone will help you with your bag." The words were polite enough, but the pause, the questioning tone, it planted something uncomfortable in Aaliyah's stomach. She knew what it felt like to be doubted, to be seen as someone who didn't belong. She walked down the aisle, her sneakers brushing against the carpet, until she reached her seat. Sliding into 3A, she set her backpack under the seat in front of her and pressed the robot keychain between her palms, whispering under her breath, "Just make it through this flight. Just 2 hours." The plane hummed softly around her as more passengers boarded. She looked out the window, the city sprawling below, the sky brightening. This was supposed to be the start of something new. But already, in the smallest of ways, she felt the weight of eyes on her, and the sting of being questioned for simply existing where others thought she did not belong. The line to board first class was short, made up mostly of men in business suits and women with sleek leather bags and sharp heels. Aaliyah clutched her backpack tighter as she stepped forward, her sneakers squeaking softly on the jet bridge carpet. She tried to steady her breathing, reminding herself of what her father had said that morning. "Walk with confidence. Keep your head up. You belong here as much as anyone else." Yet the weight of those words pressed against the gnawing feeling in her stomach. She knew from experience that belonging was not always something the world granted freely. Sometimes it had to be fought for, silently, with dignity intact. When she reached the front of the line, Rebecca Collins stood waiting again, her polished bun tight, her smile tight as well. Rebecca's gaze flicked from the boarding pass to Aaliyah's young face, and then to the plain jacket and scuffed shoes that marked her as a child, far different from the glossy adults walking in behind her. "Seat 3A, correct?" Rebecca asked. her tone rising at the end as though it were a question rather than a statement. "Yes," Aaliyah answered softly, but firmly enough to be heard. Rebecca scanned the ticket again. She did not need to. The gate agent had already done so, but she held it in her hand longer than necessary, staring at the screen as though waiting for it to tell her something different. Then, finally, she handed it back. "All right, proceed." The word carried no warmth. It was permission granted, but grudgingly. Aaliyah made her way down the aisle to her seat. She slipped into 3A, pressed against the window, trying to make herself invisible. The leather was cool beneath her hands, the air faintly tinged with the scent of coffee brewing somewhere in the galley. She placed her backpack carefully under the seat in front of her and adjusted the robot keychain so that it was visible. Having hope, her little silver robot, in sight steadied her nerves. Minutes later, another passenger slid into the aisle seat beside her. He was tall, with salt and pepper hair and a well-tailored gray suit. His leather briefcase rested lightly against his polished shoes. He looked to be in his late 40s, maybe early 50s, his face kind, but weathered from years of long workdays and endless travel. "Good morning," he said warmly as he placed his bag in the overhead compartment and settled into his seat. "Morning," Aaliyah whispered, glancing up briefly before returning her gaze to the window. He studied her with curiosity, but not judgment. Then he smiled. "Traveling alone. That's a brave thing to do at your age." Aaliyah gave a small nod. "Going to New York for a conference. I'm presenting my robotics project." His eyebrows lifted with genuine surprise. "Robotics. At 13. That's impressive." He extended his hand. "Daniel Brooks." Hesitantly. She shook it. "Aaliyah. Nice to meet you." "Aaliyah. Something tells me your parents must be very proud." She smiled faintly, feeling a flicker of warmth in her chest. "My dad is. He works for an airline." Daniel nodded. "Then I'm sure he knows what an adventure this is for you." Before Aaliyah could answer, Rebecca reappeared. She leaned into their row, eyes fixed on Aaliyah. "May I see your boarding pass again?" Daniel frowned, tilting his head. She already showed it when she got on. Rebecca didn't look at him. "Boarding pass, please." Aaliyah fumbled nervously in her jacket pocket, pulling it out and handing it over. Rebecca scanned it again, her lips pressed into a thin line, then gave it back without a word. She turned sharply and walked away. Daniel watched her retreat, his brow furrowed. "Strange," he muttered. Then he glanced at Aaliyah. "Don't worry. Probably just procedure." But Aaliyah knew better. This was not procedure. She had seen the way Rebecca's eyes narrowed, how her tone shifted. It was the same look she had received in grocery stores when she touched something expensive, or in libraries when she carried books heavier than her arms. A look that asked silently, "Are you sure you belong here?" The boarding continued, passengers filing in. Aaliyah leaned her head against the window, watching the ground crew outside in their neon vests. Her heart was heavy. She thought of her father, of his words about dignity and strength. She wanted to believe in them, but already she felt cracks forming in her resolve. Rebecca passed again, this time checking overhead bins. She stopped at their row and glanced at Daniel's neatly stowed bag before lowering her eyes once more to Aaliyah. Her gaze lingered. She turned away without a word. Daniel noticed. His lips pressed into a thin line, but he said nothing. Not yet. The engines hummed as the plane prepared for departure. Aaliyah closed her eyes, trying to imagine herself in New York, standing on a stage with her project shining under the lights. She imagined her mother smiling from the audience, her father standing proud in the back. For a moment, the image steadied her, but the sting of doubt lingered. She asked herself quietly, "Why is it always like this? Why do I have to prove I deserve to sit in a seat my father paid for? Why does the world look at me and question?" Her fingers curled around hope. "The silver robot," she whispered. "Just get through this flight. Just 2 hours." The announcement crackled overhead. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard Flight 482 with service to New York City. Please make sure your seatbelts are fastened and electronic devices are in airplane mode." Daniel leaned back, closing his eyes as the plane taxied. Aaliyah glanced at him, wondering if she should tell him how nervous she felt. But she swallowed the words. She didn't want to be seen as fragile. Not here, not now. Rebecca made one last round before takeoff, pausing briefly at their row. Her eyes skimmed over Daniel with ease, but when they landed on Aaliyah, there was that flicker again, that subtle narrowing, as if to remind her that sitting in 3A was still something unexpected. The engines roared louder, the cabin vibrating as the plane gained speed. Aaliyah's hand gripped the armrest. She closed her eyes, whispering again, "Just 2 hours." The plane lifted, the ground falling away. For a moment, her heart soared with it, rising above the city, above the doubt, above the eyes that questioned her. But deep down she knew this was only the beginning of what would be a long and difficult flight. The climb smoothed into a steady hum as the plane leveled out. The seatbelt light remained on, glowing softly above Aaliyah's head, while the cabin crew moved quietly about preparing for service. Sunlight spilled through the oval window beside her, casting golden streaks across the leather seat and the little silver robot she held in her lap. For a brief moment, Aaliyah let herself exhale. She had made it on board. She was sitting in her seat. The worst part, she told herself, was over. Yet her chest still felt heavy, like she was holding her breath even when she wasn't. Daniel Brooks, her seatmate, pulled out a newspaper from his briefcase and unfolded it with the ease of habit. His presence was comforting, not because he spoke much, but because when he looked at her, there was no question in his eyes about why she was there. No suspicion, no disbelief. He had already accepted her seat in 3A as natural, and that acceptance was like oxygen in a cabin that sometimes felt starved of it. Rebecca appeared again, gliding down the aisle with her polished shoes clicking lightly against the carpet. She stopped at row 3. Her eyes moved quickly over Daniel, then landed on Aaliyah. "Boarding pass." "Please," she said again. Her voice clipped, low enough not to draw attention from the row behind, but firm enough to sting. Aaliyah blinked. "I already showed you. I'd like to see it again." Daniel lowered his paper slowly, his jaw tightened. "This is the 3rd time," he said evenly. "What exactly are you looking for?" Rebecca's lips pressed together. "It's standard procedure when there's confusion about seating." Daniel arched an eyebrow. "Confusion? She's been in the same seat since we boarded. If there's a problem, you should say what it is instead of circling her like she doesn't belong here." Rebecca's cheeks flushed faintly, but she didn't answer him. Instead, she extended her hand toward Aaliyah. "Boarding pass." Aaliyah's fingers trembled as she reached into her pocket again. She hated that they shook. She hated that Rebecca saw it. With a slow inhale, she steadied herself, pressing Hope, the robot keychain, into her palm before handing over the pass. Rebecca scanned it once more, then returned it without comment. She turned away, her shoes tapping briskly as she moved down the aisle. Daniel exhaled sharply, muttering under his breath, "Unbelievable." Then he turned to Aaliyah, softening his tone. "Don't let her get to you. She's wrong, not you." But Aaliyah's throat ached. Wrong or not, the moment had left its mark. Each repetition chipped at her calm, leaving behind little shards of doubt. She turned to the window, blinking back the heat rising behind her eyes. Minutes later, the cabin lights dimmed slightly, signaling the start of in-flight service. Another attendant, younger and friendlier, pushed a cart down the aisle, offering drinks and snacks. When she reached their row, she smiled brightly at Daniel. "Coffee for you, sir?" "Yes, black, please," Daniel replied. The attendant turned to Aaliyah. "And for you, sweetheart, apple juice, please," Aaliyah said. The woman nodded warmly and poured the drink, setting it gently on the tray in front of her. For the first time since boarding, Aaliyah felt the warmth of kindness. She whispered a thank you, and the woman smiled as though it truly mattered. Daniel leaned slightly closer once the attendant moved on. "See, not everyone is like her. Remember that." Aaliyah nodded. She wanted to believe it, yet Rebecca's shadow loomed even in her absence. She could feel the weight of eyes, the sense that she was being watched, measured, judged. When she shifted in her seat to adjust the air vent above her head, Rebecca appeared again almost immediately. "Everything all right here?" Rebecca asked, her tone laced with a sweetness too sharp to be genuine. "I was just adjusting the air," Aaliyah said quietly. Rebecca's eyes flicked upward to the vent, then back down. "Make sure it's not disturbing anyone else." Daniel set his newspaper down completely. "That's enough," he said firmly. "She's a child. She's sitting quietly, bothering no one. If you're going to keep singling her out, maybe I should speak with the captain." Rebecca's lips thinned into a line. For a heartbeat, the air between them crackled with unspoken tension. Then she forced a smile, turned, and walked briskly away. The hum of the engines filled the silence she left behind. Aaliyah stared at her hands in her lap. She wanted to disappear, to sink into the leather seat and vanish. But another part of her, small but steady, wanted to stand taller, to refuse to let Rebecca's doubts steal the pride she carried for where she was headed and what she was capable of. Her mind drifted to her father again. She pictured him in his office, tall windows overlooking the runways, the hum of planes taking off every few minutes. She wondered if he would be proud of her for staying calm. She wondered if he would be angry if he knew what was happening. "Keep your dignity," he had said that morning. She held on to those words like a lifeline. Daniel must have sensed the storm inside her. He cleared his throat gently. "My daughter's about your age," he said. "She's stubborn, smart as anything, always building things too. You remind me of her." Aaliyah looked up at him. There was no pity in his eyes, only sincerity. She gave him a small, grateful smile. The minutes stretched on. Outside, the clouds drifted lazily below the wings. Inside, the air grew cooler. Aaliyah rubbed her arms, wishing for the warmth of a blanket. Around her, other passengers in first class began to settle under soft navy blue blankets provided by the crew. She watched as Rebecca distributed them carefully, unfolding each one and draping it across laps with practiced grace. When Rebecca reached their row, she handed a blanket to Daniel without hesitation. Then she paused, her eyes flicking to Aaliyah. For a long moment, she simply stood there, the folded fabric resting in her hands. Then she moved on without offering one. Aaliyah's stomach dropped. Her arms tightened around herself, the cold seeping into her skin. She didn't speak. Not yet. but she felt the sting, deep and sharp, as though her presence alone had disqualified her from the simple comfort every other passenger received. Daniel shifted beside her, pulling his blanket higher but glancing at Aaliyah with concern. He opened his mouth to speak, but Aaliyah shook her head quickly. Not yet. She needed a moment to decide, to gather her courage, to choose whether to accept the silence or to break it. She pressed hope into her palm again, whispering so low even Daniel could not hear. Don't let her win. Not this time. The hum of the engines carried on, steady and indifferent, as the first true fracture in the flight deepened. The cabin had settled into its rhythm, the clinking of glasses and the low murmur of conversation filling the air. Aaliyah sat very still, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes locked on the blanket draped across Daniel's knees. The fabric looked soft, its deep blue catching the dim light, promising warmth and comfort. And yet she had none. She told herself it was fine, that she could handle a little chill. She told herself it wasn't worth making a scene, but the truth pressed against her chest like a stone. Everyone else around her had been given a blanket. Everyone else was swaddled comfortably while she rubbed her arms and pretended not to notice. Daniel shifted beside her, clearing his throat. He glanced at her, then back down at his blanket. Finally, he lowered his voice. She didn't give you one, did she? Aaliyah shook her head once, quickly, almost ashamed to admit it. Daniel's jaw tightened. He leaned back in his seat, exhaling through his nose. That's not an oversight. That's intentional. The word stung, not because she didn't already know, but because hearing them aloud made the truth undeniable. Rebecca appeared again, moving gracefully through the aisle. She checked on a passenger in 2B, adjusted a bag in the overhead bin, and smiled politely at a woman cradling her infant in 1C. When her eyes swept past Aaliyah, they barely lingered, as if the girl were invisible until she needed to be reminded of her place. Aaliyah's thoughts tangled. Maybe she should say something. Maybe she should ask for a blanket. But the idea of speaking up felt like stepping into a storm. What if Rebecca dismissed her again? What if her voice trembled and made her look weak? What if the other passengers turned to stare, silently questioning her right to sit there at all? Her father's voice echoed in her head. Dignity. Always dignity. But what did dignity mean in this moment? Was it silence, enduring without complaint? Or was it raising her voice, demanding the same courtesy as everyone else? She couldn't decide. Rebecca passed their row again, her perfume sharp and floral. Daniel leaned slightly forward, his voice calm but deliberate. Excuse me, could we have a blanket for her? Rebecca paused, her hand resting on the cart. Her smile tightened. I'm sorry, sir, but we don't have extras available. Daniel gestured subtly toward the rows ahead, where several empty seats held unused folded blankets. There are blankets right there. Rebecca's eyes flicked briefly to the seats, then back to him. Those are reserved. Reserved. Daniel's voice rose slightly. For whom Rebecca's smile didn't falter. For other passengers who may request them later. Daniel gave a short laugh, incredulous. She is a passenger. She's requesting one now. Rebecca's eyes shifted to Aaliyah at last. The glance was quick, assessing, and laced with something colder than indifference. I'll see what I can do, she said lightly, then moved on without another word. Aaliyah felt her cheeks burn, her body tensed, every muscle aching with the effort to hold herself still. The exchange had drawn the attention of a few nearby passengers. A man in 4C leaned forward slightly, watching. A woman in 2A shifted uncomfortably, her lips pressed tight as though she wanted to intervene but couldn't find the courage. Daniel muttered under his breath, "Outrageous. Absolutely outrageous." Aaliyah stared down at her robot keychain, her thumb brushing the tiny metal surface. Hope. That was its name. But Hope felt fragile here, delicate as glass. The cold deepened. She crossed her arms over her chest, curling slightly against the window. Outside, the clouds drifted by in endless white waves, indifferent to what unfolded inside the cabin. Time dragged. Rebecca did not return with a blanket. Aaliyah's mind spiraled. Maybe it was her fault. Maybe she had looked too nervous boarding, or spoken too softly. Maybe she didn't carry herself with the kind of authority people expected in this section of the plane. But no. She shook the thoughts away. She knew better. She had done nothing wrong. Still, the questions burrowed deep, whispering insidiously, "Why me, why now?" Why always the ache in her chest grew heavier. She thought of her father again, imagined calling him, telling him what was happening. But he wasn't here. He wasn't in seat 3B beside her. He couldn't shield her from the sting of exclusion. This fight, she realized, was hers to endure. Daniel leaned closer once more, his voice low. "You deserve better than this. Aaliyah, don't let her make you think otherwise." She nodded faintly, her lips pressed tight, but her eyes glistened. She refused to let the tears fall. Not here. Not now. Another attendant passed through the cabin, this one older, with kind eyes and a tired smile. She noticed Aaliyah's bare arms and paused. "Are you cold, sweetheart?" Aaliyah hesitated, then nodded. Before the attendant could move, Rebecca appeared suddenly, as if summoned. "I've already handled it," she said curtly. The older woman's brows knitted, handled what Rebecca's smile returned, brittle and bright. "The young lady is fine." Her tone was final, a dismissal. The older attendant hesitated, her eyes flicking between Aaliyah and Rebecca. Then she nodded reluctantly and moved on. The silence that followed was deafening. Aaliyah's heart pounded, her pulse loud in her ears. She wanted to scream, to shout that she was not fine, but the words caught in her throat, trapped beneath the weight of fear and pride and the desperate need to protect herself. Daniel leaned back, his fists clenched on his lap. "This is unacceptable," he muttered. "If she doesn't fix this, I will." Aaliyah stared at the silver robot in her palm. She whispered again, too softly for anyone to hear. "Just 2 hours. Just make it 2 hours." But in her gut, she knew the silence could not last. The cabin lights dimmed further as the plane settled into cruising altitude. Most of the passengers had reclined their seats, wrapping themselves in the soft navy blue blankets that had been distributed earlier. The hum of the engines was steady, almost soothing, but for Aaliyah it felt like a backdrop to a storm slowly gathering inside her chest. Her arms were stiff from holding herself tightly, trying to contain the chill that had seeped deep into her bones. The air conditioning vent above continued its low hiss, and each gust of cool air felt like a reminder that she had been denied something so small, so ordinary, yet so meaningful. Daniel noticed. His eyes shifted from his own blanket to her bare arms. His voice was gentle, but laced with frustration. "You're freezing," he said. "This is absurd." He pulled his own blanket down from his lap and started to drape it over her. Aaliyah stopped him quickly, shaking her head. "No. You need it." "I'll be fine," he said firmly. I can't sit here and watch this. But Aaliyah pressed his hand back toward him. Please, I don't want to take yours. That's not the point. Daniel exhaled heavily, his jaw tightening again. Then we'll make it the point. He straightened in his seat and pressed the call button above his head. A small chime rang out, and moments later Rebecca appeared, her expression a mask of calm professionalism. Yes. Sir, Daniel's voice was steady, but carried a sharp edge now. She still hasn't received a blanket. Everyone else has one. Why is that? Rebecca's smile was thin. As I explained earlier, we don't have extras available. That's not true, Daniel replied, his voice rising just enough for passengers nearby to hear. He gestured toward the row across the aisle, where 2 empty seats still had neatly folded blankets resting untouched. There are blankets right there. What kind of game are you playing? Rebecca's posture stiffened. Those are not available. Daniel's brow furrowed. Not available to whom? Or should I ask? Not available to her for the first time. The cabin seemed to truly take notice. A murmur ran through the rows around them. A man in 4C leaned forward, his eyes narrowing at the exchange. The woman in 2A, who had shifted uncomfortably earlier, now turned her gaze directly on Rebecca, her lips parting as though ready to say something. Rebecca's eyes flicked quickly around the cabin, then returned to Daniel. Sir, I'll thank you not to raise your voice. I'll raise it as much as I need to when I see a child being treated unfairly. Daniel snapped. Give her a blanket. Now. The words struck like a crack of thunder. Aaliyah felt every eye in the cabin shift toward her, the heat of their attention burning into her skin. She wanted to disappear, to melt into her seat. But another part of her, deep and quiet, felt a spark ignite. For once, someone else was saying what she had wanted to say all along. Rebecca's smile faltered, but she recovered quickly. Sir, please calm down. The young lady doesn't need special treatment. Special treatment? Daniel's voice cut sharp through the hum of the cabin. She's asking for the same courtesy every single person here has already received. That's not special treatment. That's basic human decency. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the cabin. The woman in 2A spoke up now, her voice firm. He's right. I saw you pass her by. Don't insult our intelligence by pretending it was anything else, the man in 4C added. This is ridiculous. Give the girl a blanket. Rebecca's composure cracked for the briefest moment. Her eyes hardened, and she turned back to Aaliyah, as though the girl herself were somehow to blame for the rising tide of voices. Do you need a blanket? She asked finally, her tone sharp, almost accusatory. Aaliyah's breath caught in her chest, the weight of every stare pressed on her. This was the moment she had dreaded, the moment she had imagined in countless scenarios but never wanted to face. To speak meant to expose herself, to admit vulnerability. To stay silent meant to accept invisibility. Her father's words rang again in her memory. Dignity. Always dignity. But what did dignity look like here? She swallowed hard, her voice quiet but steady. Yes, I need a blanket. The cabin seemed to hold its breath. Rebecca hesitated, her lips pressed tightly together. For a heartbeat, it looked as though she might refuse, even now. Then, slowly, she turned and retrieved one of the folded blankets from the empty seat across the aisle. She unfolded it stiffly, her movements sharp and mechanical, before thrusting it toward Aaliyah. Here, she said, the single word laced with coldness. Aaliyah took it carefully, her hands trembling, not from the cold this time, but from the intensity of the moment. She spread the blanket over her lap, the warmth sinking into her skin, but the sting of humiliation lingered. Daniel leaned closer, his voice softer now, but full of resolve. "You did nothing wrong. Remember that." Aaliyah nodded faintly, clutching the edge of the blanket in her fists. Her chest ached, her heart pounding against her ribs. The murmurs in the cabin grew louder. A man further back called out, "Unbelievable behavior from a flight attendant." Another passenger muttered, "She should be reported." Rebecca stood stiffly, her face flushed, her eyes darting from passenger to passenger. Then, without another word, she turned and marched back toward the galley. The silence she left behind was heavy but charged. Aaliyah stared down at the blanket on her lap. Conflicted. She had it now. The thing she had wanted. The thing she had needed. But it didn't feel like comfort. It felt like a battle won at too high a cost. Inside, her emotions tangled. Relief, humiliation, anger, pride. They swirled together until she couldn't tell one from the other. She pressed Hope, the little robot, against her palm again. Its metal edges were cool and grounding. She whispered in her mind, "Hold on. Just hold on." Daniel exhaled slowly beside her, shaking his head. "This isn't over," he muttered, and he was right, because while the blanket now warmed her skin, the coldness that had driven this entire exchange still lingered in the air, sharp and undeniable. The blanket rested across Aaliyah's lap, its fabric warm against her skin. Yet inside she felt no warmth at all. Her hands clutched the edges tightly, twisting the cloth in her fists as if it could anchor her against the swell of emotions inside. Relief, humiliation, and anger warred with one another, leaving her chest tight and her throat aching. Around her, the atmosphere in the cabin had shifted. What had once been the quiet luxury of a first-class cabin was now charged with tension. Conversations that had been polite and hushed turned into murmurs, whispers traveling up and down the rows like invisible currents. Some passengers glanced at Aaliyah with sympathy, others with discomfort, and a few with open disapproval aimed not at her, but at the uniformed woman who had walked briskly back toward the galley. Daniel leaned slightly closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "You showed real strength just now. Don't let her make you question that." Aaliyah didn't answer right away. Her eyes stayed fixed on the small robot she now held in her palm, the little silver figure she called Hope. She rubbed her thumb across its surface, grounding herself. She wanted to believe Daniel. But the moment replayed in her head on an endless loop Rebecca's cold tone, the eyes of the passengers, her own quiet voice admitting what she needed. She had spoken up, and yet, instead of feeling triumphant, she felt exposed. From the galley, a hushed conversation carried faintly into the cabin. Rebecca's voice, sharp and insistent, rose above the low hum for just a moment before fading again. A second voice, another attendant, sounded hesitant, almost conciliatory. Passengers exchanged glances. The woman in 2A leaned toward the man beside her and whispered something he nodded to. His lips pressed tight with disapproval. A man in 5D shook his head audibly, muttering, "Disgraceful," under his breath. Aaliyah's pulse quickened. She had never been the center of attention before, not like this. At school, she was the quiet one who raised her hand with the right answer, the one who stayed late in the science lab, tinkering with circuits. She was comfortable in the background, where her brilliance could shine without the burden of eyes. Now, every eye in the cabin seemed to burn against her, and she wished desperately for invisibility. Daniel must have sensed it. He leaned in again, his voice steady. almost like a shield. "You don't owe anyone shame. What happened here says more about her than it ever will about you." But even as he spoke, Rebecca reemerged from the galley. Her expression was carefully composed, her smile polished and professional, but the stiffness in her shoulders betrayed her. She moved down the aisle, checking on passengers in rows 1 and 2, avoiding Aaliyah and Daniel entirely. When she reached the back of first class, another passenger stopped her. It was the man in 4C, tall and broad-shouldered, with a calm authority in his voice. "Excuse me," he said, his tone polite but firm. "I'd like to know why that girl had to wait so long for a blanket when everyone else had one from the start." Rebecca's smile didn't waver. "I assure you, sir, there was no issue. She has a blanket now." "That's not an answer," the man replied evenly. "I watched you skip her row twice. Then when others spoke up, you pretended there were none left. That's not how you treat a child, or any passenger." A ripple of agreement moved through the rows. The woman in 2A nodded, her voice carrying. "I saw the same thing. It wasn't an accident." Rebecca's eyes hardened. For a moment, her mask slipped, and Aaliyah caught the flash of irritation beneath. But just as quickly, the smile returned. "I'll be sure to make a note of your concerns," she said briskly, before moving on. The murmurs didn't fade this time. They grew louder, passengers leaning into one another, sharing their disbelief. The hum of the engines was now undercut by the low chorus of voices rising against injustice. Aaliyah shifted in her seat, pulling the blanket tighter around her. Part of her longed to sink into the comfort of anonymity again, for the whispers to fade and the spotlight to disappear. Yet another part of her, deep and steady, recognized something important. These voices weren't condemning her. They were standing with her. They were exposing what she had felt, but been too afraid to name. Still, her stomach churned with unease. She pressed hope against her palm again and whispered inwardly, "What if this only makes things worse? What if she comes back angrier?" Daniel noticed her unease and gave her a reassuring nod. Sometimes silence feeds the wrong things. What's happening here? It matters. The minutes ticked by, slowly. Rebecca disappeared once more, and a new attendant came to refresh drinks, her kindness noticeably more deliberate. She offered Aaliyah another apple juice, smiling gently as though to balance the weight of her colleague's cruelty. Aaliyah whispered a soft thank you, her voice barely audible. The attendant squeezed her shoulder lightly before moving on, a simple gesture that sent a wave of relief through her chest. But the tension wasn't gone. It lingered, heavy and waiting. In the back of first class, the man in 4C caught Daniel's eye and gave a small nod, an unspoken message of solidarity. The woman in 2A leaned into the aisle, her gaze softening when it met Aaliyah's. For the first time since boarding, Aaliyah felt something stir in her chest besides fear or humiliation. It was small, fragile, but real. A sense of belonging. A sense that others saw her not as an intruder in this space, but as a person who deserved to be there. Rebecca returned again, her steps quicker, her smile tighter. She avoided meeting anyone's gaze as she moved swiftly toward the cockpit door. Her hand brushed the handle, and for a moment it looked as though she might knock. Instead, she turned sharply and disappeared back into the galley. A hush settled over the cabin again, this time thick with anticipation. Passengers exchanged knowing looks. Something larger was coming. Aaliyah sat very still, her fingers curled tightly around Hope. Her mind raced. What if Rebecca complained to the captain? What if she twisted the story, made Aaliyah sound like the problem? The thought made her stomach twist. She closed her eyes for a moment and breathed deeply. In her mind, she pictured her father's face, Marcus Carter, with his steady gaze and the voice that never wavered when he told her she belonged in every room she entered. She imagined him sitting beside her, telling her to hold her ground. When she opened her eyes, Daniel was watching her. He gave her another nod, quiet but full of certainty. "You're not alone in this. Don't forget that." The hum of the engines continued, steady and relentless, but beneath it, the whispers of the passengers carried on, threads of resistance weaving themselves into something stronger. The storm had not yet broken, but the clouds were gathering fast. The air inside the cabin seemed to thicken, heavy with something unspoken. The passengers had returned to their seats, conversations low but urgent, like people whispering at the edge of a storm. Aaliyah sat pressed against the window, the blanket finally warming her skin, though her body still trembled with a mix of adrenaline and unease. She wished the warmth could sink deeper, past her skin and bones, to the part of her heart that still felt chilled by what had happened. Rebecca had disappeared again. For a moment, Aaliyah thought perhaps the attendant would avoid her altogether now, let the flight pass in tense silence. But then she noticed movement near the galley. Rebecca speaking with another crew member, her gestures sharp, her smile brittle. The conversation was quiet, but every so often, Rebecca's voice rose just enough to carry faintly down the aisle. Daniel leaned toward Aaliyah. "She's not letting it go," he said under his breath. "She's making this about her." Aaliyah's chest tightened. "What if she gets me in trouble?" she whispered. "You didn't do anything wrong," Daniel said firmly, "and everyone here knows it. Don't let her twist the truth in your head." Still, Aaliyah's stomach churned. She knew Daniel was right, but the fear was there anyway, raw and insistent. She had been taught that sometimes it didn't matter if you were right. Sometimes people with power decided who was wrong, and that was the end of it. The murmur of passengers grew louder when Rebecca finally walked down the aisle again, her steps brisk, her posture stiff with determination. She didn't look at Aaliyah or Daniel as she passed. Instead, she stopped near the cockpit door. For a moment she hesitated, then raised her hand and knocked lightly. A hush fell across the cabin. Heads turned, whispers quieted. Everyone seemed to hold their breath as the cockpit door opened slightly, revealing another flight attendant on the inside. Rebecca leaned in, speaking quickly, her words too low for most to hear. Aaliyah's heart hammered in her chest. She felt exposed again, as if her name, her presence, was being carried down the aisle and into that sacred space where the captain sat. She clutched Hope, the little silver robot, in her palm so tightly its edges pressed into her skin. Daniel's expression hardened. "She's taking it to the captain," he muttered. The woman in 2A leaned forward, whispering across the aisle to them, "Don't worry. We saw what happened. We'll back you up if we need to." The man in 4C added, "She can't spin this. Too many witnesses." Their words should have comforted Aaliyah, and part of her was grateful. But another part braced itself. She knew enough to understand that authority could be complicated, that sometimes truth bent beneath the weight of uniforms and hierarchy. The cockpit door opened wider, and for a brief second, the captain himself came into view. He was tall, with silver hair and a lined but commanding face. His eyes flicked past Rebecca into the cabin, scanning quickly as though measuring the tension in the air. Then he nodded once and disappeared back inside. the door closing firmly behind him. Rebecca turned sharply, her smile once again fixed in place. She strode back toward the galley, her expression unreadable. The whispers erupted again. Passengers shifted in their seats, speculating, questioning. Some looked toward Aaliyah with sympathy, others with subtle curiosity. Aaliyah sank lower in her seat, her face burning. She hated the attention, hated that her presence in this cabin had turned into a story unfolding before strangers. She wanted to be invisible again. She wanted the flight to end. Daniel noticed her retreat and leaned closer. "Listen to me. This isn't your shame to carry. It's hers. If the captain comes, you look him in the eye. You tell the truth. You've done nothing wrong." Aaliyah nodded faintly, but her stomach twisted tighter. She imagined her father's voice, imagined how he would have handled this. Calm, steady, unshaken. She tried to summon that strength, to wear it like armor. But she was 13, and her voice had trembled, just admitting she needed a blanket. The intercom crackled suddenly, startling her. A calm male voice filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We understand there has been some concern in the cabin, and I want to assure you it will be addressed appropriately. Thank you for your patience." The whispers exploded once more. Passengers exchanged incredulous glances. Aaliyah's pulse raced. The captain knew. Everyone knew. Rebecca reappeared, her smile thinner now, her eyes darting from passenger to passenger. She moved through the cabin with deliberate composure, but every step betrayed tension. She paused at the front, speaking softly with another attendant, then vanished again into the galley. Daniel shook his head slowly. She thinks she can control the narrative, but the captain doesn't sound blind to it. The woman in 2A leaned over again, her voice low but fierce. "If the captain asks, I'll tell him exactly what I saw. She singled you out. No one should have to go through that." Aaliyah looked at her, grateful but still overwhelmed. "Thank you," she whispered. The woman smiled warmly. "You're stronger than you know." The minutes that followed stretched long, filled with quiet anticipation. Every rustle of fabric, every click of a seatbelt buckle, every footstep of a crew member sounded amplified. The cabin was waiting, suspended in the space between injustice exposed and justice delivered. Finally, the cockpit door opened again. This time the captain stepped fully into the cabin. His uniform was crisp, his presence commanding, but his eyes carried a kind of tired compassion that softened his sternness. He moved slowly down the aisle, and as he did, conversations hushed until the only sound was the steady hum of the engines. He stopped near Aaliyah's row, his gaze sweeping briefly over her, Daniel, and the passengers nearby. He inclined his head slightly to Daniel before crouching down so his eyes met Aaliyah's. His voice was low, steady, and kind. "Miss, my name is Captain Harris. Could you tell me in your own words what happened?" Aaliyah froze. Her throat tightened, her palms clammy. She looked at Daniel, then at the woman in 2A, then down at the little robot in her hand. Hope gleamed faintly in the dim light. She took a breath. Her voice was soft but clear. "She didn't give me a blanket. She gave everyone else one. When I asked, she said there weren't any. But there were." The captain's eyes never left hers. He nodded slowly. "Thank you for telling me." He turned slightly, his gaze landing on Daniel. Daniel spoke firmly. "She's telling the truth. I saw it all, and so did others." The man in 4C leaned forward. "I can confirm it." She skipped her deliberately. The woman in 2O added, "It wasn't an accident. It was intentional." The captain absorbed it all, his expression unreadable but grave. Finally, he straightened, his posture tall and resolute. "I appreciate your honesty," he said. "I will handle this." He turned, his eyes scanning the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We expect professionalism and fairness on every flight. If that standard has not been met, it will be addressed." With that, he moved down the aisle, heading directly toward the galley. The silence that followed was heavy but electric. Passengers exchanged looks of relief, of anticipation, of quiet approval. Aaliyah sat very still, her heart pounding. She wasn't sure if she felt better or worse, but she knew one thing. The silence was broken. Captain Harris's footsteps echoed softly against the carpeted aisle as he disappeared into the galley. For a long moment, the cabin remained suspended in silence, every passenger leaning into the tension as though waiting for thunder to follow lightning. The door closed behind him, and though the hum of the engines was constant, the weight of expectation pressed down heavily. Aaliyah gripped the little robot in her hand tighter, her pulse drumming in her ears. She wondered what the captain would say, what words might be exchanged behind that thin door. She imagined Rebecca twisting the story, painting herself as the professional, the authority, the one wronged. She imagined him listening and believing. The thought made her chest ache. Daniel noticed the worry in her eyes. He leaned closer, his voice steady. "Trust me, the truth is stronger than her lies. People saw it. People spoke up. That matters." Aaliyah nodded faintly, though inside she wrestled with the voice of doubt that whispered, "It doesn't always matter." She knew too many stories, had heard her father recount too many times when the truth had been ignored. Inside the galley, muffled voices rose. Rebecca's tone was sharp, defensive, each syllable clipped like the snap of a string pulled too tight. Another voice joined, calmer, measured. That must have been Captain Harris. A third, softer voice entered as well, likely one of the other attendants. Passengers leaned subtly forward in their seats, straining to hear. The woman in 2A exchanged a look with the man in 4C, both of them frowning. Finally, the door opened. Captain Harris emerged, his posture tall, his jaw set with quiet authority. Behind him, Rebecca followed, her face carefully composed, though the tightness around her mouth betrayed the storm beneath. Another attendant trailed them, her expression uneasy. The captain stepped forward into the cabin, his presence commanding enough to silence even the whispers. He stopped near Aaliyah's row again, his eyes sweeping over the passengers before landing firmly on Rebecca. "Miss Collins," he said evenly, his voice carrying through the cabin without the need to raise it. "Would you care to explain to these passengers why one of them was denied basic service?" A hush fell even deeper over the room. Rebecca's eyes flicked to the passengers, then back to him. Her smile strained. "Captain, with respect, I was following procedure. We have limited supplies and limited supplies," he repeated, his tone neutral but his eyes sharp. Yet blankets were visible in unused seats. Rebecca hesitated. "Those were reserved." For whom the captain asked. The question cut through the cabin like a blade. Rebecca opened her mouth, then closed it again, no answer forming quickly enough. The man in 4C spoke up, his voice firm. "They weren't reserved. They were untouched. We all saw it," the woman in 2A added. She skipped her deliberately. "It wasn't about supplies." Rebecca's composure cracked just slightly, her eyes flashing. With all due respect, passengers often misunderstand crew procedures. Captain Harris's gaze hardened. And do they also misunderstand tone and tension? Repeated neglect. Rebecca's lips pressed together tightly. No smile now. Her hands clasped in front of her, fingers twisting together. Daniel shifted in his seat. Captain, this isn't complicated. A child was humiliated. That's what happened here. The captain nodded slowly. So it seems. He turned fully to Rebecca. Professionalism is not optional on my aircraft. Neither is fairness. Do you understand? Rebecca's jaw tightened. Yes, Captain, she said softly. Her voice clipped. Then you will apologize, he said firmly, his eyes never leaving hers. The cabin seemed to hold its breath again. Aaliyah's chest tightened, her fingers digging into the blanket on her lap. She wasn't sure if she wanted to hear the apology or if she dreaded it. Would it be genuine? Or would it only deepen the sting? Rebecca turned stiffly, her eyes finally meeting Aaliyah's. For a heartbeat, there was no expression there at all, just the cold surface of someone forced into a corner. Then, her lips parted. I'm sorry, she said. The words were flat, mechanical, almost spat rather than spoken. The passenger shifted, unimpressed. The woman in 2A let out a soft scoff. The man in 4C shook his head. Daniel leaned closer to Aaliyah, whispering, That's not an apology. That's a performance. Aaliyah's throat felt dry. She didn't respond. She just pulled Hope tighter into her palm and let the words wash over her without entering. Captain Harris's expression darkened. Miss Collins, I expect sincerity when you address passengers. Let me remind you, this airline's reputation does not hinge on the comfort of its crew, but on the dignity of its travelers. You will remember that. Rebecca's face flushed, and this time her voice trembled slightly as she repeated, I'm sorry for not treating you with the respect you deserve. It was better, though still brittle. Aaliyah nodded faintly, not because she believed it, but because she wanted the moment to end. The captain gave her a small, reassuring nod, then turned back to the cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, I regret that any of you witnessed behavior below the standard of this airline. I assure you it will be dealt with properly. For the remainder of this flight, my crew will show the professionalism you expect and deserve. The passengers murmured their approval. Some nodded firmly. Others whispered to one another with satisfaction. Rebecca stepped back, her posture rigid, her eyes avoiding Aaliyah's. The other attendant beside her shifted uneasily, as though embarrassed by the whole ordeal. The captain gave Aaliyah one last glance, his eyes steady and kind, before he returned toward the cockpit. His presence left a lingering calm, but the cabin was far from at ease. Daniel leaned closer again. He handled it, but don't think for a second this ends here. Actions have consequences. Aaliyah's chest rose and fell quickly. She felt a strange mix of relief and exhaustion. She had not asked for this fight, but somehow it had found her, and now everyone on this plane carried a piece of the story. She looked out the window, the endless stretch of clouds bathed in moonlight. Somewhere below, cities glowed faintly in the dark. She wondered if her father was awake, working late as he often did. She imagined his phone buzzing, a message finding him even here, high above the world. The thought made her heart tighten, not with fear, but with the fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, justice traveled faster than cruelty. The whispers in the cabin began again, this time less sharp, more like currents of reassurance. Passengers leaned toward one another, voices soft but clear. She stood up for herself. That captain was right. Unbelievable that it even happened. For the first time since the blanket had been denied, Aaliyah felt a breath escape her chest without weight pressing it back down. She wasn't healed. She wasn't unscarred. But she wasn't alone anymore. The storm had broken, and though the air was still charged, there was clarity now. The cabin had settled. But it wasn't peace. It was the kind of uneasy quiet that comes after thunder when the air is still heavy, waiting for the next strike. Passengers shifted in their seats, whispering in low tones, their glances darting often toward Aaliyah and then toward the galley where Rebecca had disappeared. Aaliyah sat curled in her seat, the blanket over her legs. Hope clutched tightly in her palm. She had survived the humiliation. She had endured the apology, brittle and forced though it had been. Yet her body still hummed with tension, her mind circling what had just unfolded. Daniel leaned closer, his voice steady. She won't forget this, and neither will anyone else on this plane. Aaliyah gave him a small nod. She wished that was enough to ease the ache in her chest. She wished she could believe that this was over. But it wasn't. Rebecca reemerged a few minutes later, her movements brisk, her face composed but pale. She avoided eye contact with every passenger as she hurried down the aisle and slipped back into the galley. The other attendant followed her quickly, casting an apologetic look toward Aaliyah before disappearing too. The woman in 2A leaned across the aisle, whispering, "You think she's done? I don't. She's too rattled." The man in 4C shook his head slowly. "No, this isn't over. She's protecting herself. And when people like that feel cornered, they double down." Daniel glanced at both of them, then back to Aaliyah. His expression was serious, protective. Whatever happens next, you remember this truth has a way of cutting through noise. Just hold steady. Aaliyah wanted to believe him. She pressed hope against her cheek for a moment, letting the cool metal ground her. Then it happened. The intercom buzzed again, this time with a different tone, sharper, more urgent. The voice was Captain Harris's, but he wasn't addressing the passengers. His words were clipped, professional, meant for his crew. Still, some of it carried into the cabin. "Collins, report to the cockpit. Now." The murmur swept through the cabin like wind through dry leaves. Heads turned, whispers surged, eyes widened. Rebecca appeared almost instantly, her face stiff as stone, and strode toward the cockpit door. She knocked once before being admitted inside. The door closed with a firm click. The whispers grew louder. Passengers speculated in quick bursts. He called her in. "She's in trouble. About time." Aaliyah's chest tightened. Her palms grew sweaty against the robot she clutched. What was happening behind that door? Minutes dragged. Daniel sat upright now, his jaw clenched, his eyes on the cockpit. The man in 4C leaned forward, elbows on his knees, watching intently. The woman in 2A chewed her lip nervously, glancing between Aaliyah and the cockpit door. Then, unexpectedly, the captain's voice filled the cabin again, this time through the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, I appreciate your patience. I've been in direct contact with operations on the ground. The matter brought to my attention is being documented as we speak." The cabin erupted in whispers again, louder now, more incredulous. "Operation," someone muttered. "They're reporting it already." Daniel's brows lifted. He turned to Aaliyah. "You hear that? This isn't just staying on this plane. It's reaching the ground." Aaliyah's pulse spiked. A mix of fear and relief tangled inside her chest. She had wanted justice, but the idea of her story flying ahead of her, landing before she did, terrified her. What would her father think when he heard the cockpit door opened again? Rebecca emerged, her face pale, her composure cracking. She walked quickly toward the galley, avoiding every eye, her shoulders stiff. Behind her, Captain Harris stepped out briefly, his presence commanding once more. He addressed the passengers directly. "Ladies and gentlemen, you deserve transparency. A report has been made to my superiors regarding the incident you witnessed. It is not acceptable, and it will not be ignored. I want to thank those of you who spoke up. Your voices matter." The passengers responded with soft murmurs of approval, some nodding firmly, others speaking quietly to one another. Rebecca disappeared again, but her absence no longer felt like control. It felt like retreat. Still, Aaliyah couldn't shake the unease. She leaned toward Daniel. "What if this gets bigger? What if people blame me for causing trouble?" Daniel looked at her, his gaze steady. "Listen to me. You didn't cause trouble. You told the truth. There's a difference. Never confuse the two." The man in 4C leaned over, his voice calm but strong. "He's right. The trouble was already there. You just didn't hide it." The woman in 2A smiled softly. "And look at all of us now. We're not whispering about you. We're standing with you." Aaliyah blinked quickly, her eyes stinging. She looked down at Hope, her little robot, and for the first time since the flight began, she felt a flicker of pride. She hadn't meant to spark all this, but maybe it mattered that she had. The minutes stretched on. The cabin slowly began to settle, though the tension lingered like the aftertaste of something bitter. The crew moved more carefully now, their smiles softer, their gestures more deliberate. It was as though they, too, understood that eyes were watching, that every action mattered. Daniel ordered a coffee, the attendant delivering it quickly, her tone gentle. When she turned to Aaliyah, she offered another juice without being asked, her smile kind. "Thank you," Aaliyah said, her voice quiet, but steadier than before. The attendant nodded, almost as if to say, "I see you." Then, just as calm began to settle, the captain's voice filled the intercom again. "Miss Carter," he said clearly, and every head turned toward Aaliyah. "When we land, someone very important will be waiting to speak with you. I want you to know you are safe and respected here." The cabin went utterly still. Passengers turned in their seats, glancing at her with a mix of curiosity and admiration. Aaliyah's heart pounded so hard she thought it might echo. She leaned toward Daniel, whispering urgently, "What does that mean? Who's waiting for me?" Daniel's expression softened. He hesitated for a moment, then smiled faintly. "I think you're about to find out just how far the truth travels, even up here." Aaliyah swallowed hard, her chest tightening with both fear and anticipation. She didn't know what awaited her on the ground, but something told her this story was far from finished. For the first time, she wasn't just afraid. She was curious. The rest of the flight unfolded like a taut string stretched to its limit. Passengers had returned to their seats, conversations hushed but electric, as though everyone was waiting for the final act of a play they could not yet see. The hum of the engines filled the silence, a steady reminder that though they floated 30,000 feet in the air, the world below was preparing to catch them in its grip. Aaliyah pressed her forehead against the window. The darkness of the night sky stretched endlessly, broken only by clusters of city lights flickering far beneath them. It should have been calming, but instead it felt like a stage light bright, exposing, leaving nowhere to hide. She turned to Daniel, her voice low. "Why would the captain say that? Why would someone be waiting for me?" Daniel studied her carefully, his eyes thoughtful. Because what happened here didn't just stay in this cabin. The moment he contacted operations, it became more than a small dispute. It became an incident. And incidents draw attention. But why me? Aaliyah asked, her voice trembling slightly. I didn't do anything. That's exactly why, Daniel said softly. Because you were the one wronged. Because you showed courage, even when you didn't want to. That's why people will be waiting. Aaliyah held hope in her palm, her thumb brushing over the little robot's head. She tried to believe his words, but another part of her whispered doubts. Would they treat her like a child caught in trouble? Would they blame her for exposing something they wished had stayed hidden? The cabin door to the cockpit opened again. Captain Harris stepped out, his presence drawing every eye. His expression was calm but serious, and when he spoke, his voice carried evenly throughout the cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, we will be beginning our descent shortly. I want to thank you for your patience and cooperation during this flight. Please know that the concerns raised tonight have been escalated and will be addressed properly. No one here will leave without being heard. His eyes swept briefly over the passengers before resting on Aaliyah for the smallest moment. Then he nodded once and returned to the cockpit. The passengers began to murmur again, but this time it wasn't suspicion or outrage. It was something closer to approval, even respect. The woman in 2A leaned across the aisle toward Aaliyah. You've got people on your side. Sweetheart, don't be afraid. The man in 4C nodded. He meant what he said. No one's sweeping this under the rug. Aaliyah swallowed hard, her throat dry. She wanted to believe them, but her body still trembled with unease. She looked at Daniel. What if it's too much for me? Daniel's gaze softened. Then lean on those who are here to help you. You don't have to carry this alone. The engines shifted, the pitch changing as the plane began its descent. The seatbelt light glowed overhead, casting a soft orange reflection across the cabin. Attendants moved quietly down the aisles, checking buckles and tray tables, their movements subdued. Rebecca was nowhere to be seen. Aaliyah's stomach twisted as pressure changed in her ears. She stared at the silver robot in her palm, whispering almost too softly to hear. Stay strong, like Daddy said. The ground rose closer. Through the window, the city below grew brighter, streets threading together like veins of gold, neighborhoods glowing like constellations. The plane dipped lower, the lights spreading wider until the world seemed to open its arms. The landing gear thudded beneath them. A moment later, the tires met the runway with a shudder, the cabin lurching as the engines roared in reverse. Aaliyah's body pressed into her seat, her heart racing faster than the ground rushing beneath them. When the plane slowed and finally taxied toward the gate, the passengers exhaled almost in unison. Relief hung in the air, but it was tangled with anticipation. Everyone knew the story wasn't done. The seatbelt light chimed off, but no one moved. People stayed seated, waiting, watching. It was as though they sensed that leaving now would mean missing the conclusion to a story they had all unwillingly become part of. Aaliyah sat frozen, her blanket pooled around her, hope clutched in her palm. Her chest tightened with every passing second. She could almost hear her father's voice in her mind, calm and steady, telling her that the truth always stood taller in the end. Then the intercom buzzed one final time. Miss Carter, Captain Harris said, his voice firm yet warm. Please remain seated. A member of our leadership team is waiting to meet you at the gate. The whisper swelled instantly. Passengers turned in their seats, exchanging incredulous looks. Some leaned closer to one another, voices carrying just enough to be heard. Leadership team. Someone important. This girl must matter more than we thought. Daniel looked at Aaliyah, his eyes steady. Are you ready? Aaliyah shook her head faintly. No, but I'll go anyway. The plane eased into the gate, the jet bridge locking into place with a dull thud. The doors opened. Passengers stood, retrieving bags from the overhead bins, though many lingered, their movements slower than usual, their glances often darting toward Aaliyah. An attendant stepped down the aisle, her voice polite but formal. Miss Carter, please wait here for an escort. Aaliyah's chest tightened, but she nodded. She glanced at Daniel. Will you stay with me? Of course, he said without hesitation. The aisle cleared, passengers disembarking one by one. But instead of rushing away, several paused near her seat, offering words of support. You did nothing wrong, said the man in 4C, his voice calm. We're proud of you, added the woman in 2A, her smile warm. Others nodded as they passed, their eyes soft with understanding. Finally, the cabin emptied, leaving only Aaliyah, Daniel, and the crew. Rebecca lingered in the galley, her face pale and her expression unreadable. She did not speak. The attendant returned, her tone gentle. Miss Carter, it's time. Aaliyah rose slowly, her legs trembling beneath her. She tucked the little robot into her pocket, drew the blanket tighter around her shoulders, and followed the attendant down the aisle. Daniel walked just behind her, his presence a steady anchor. The door of the plane loomed closer, the light of the terminal spilling through. Her breath quickened. Each step felt heavier, as though she were walking towards something immense, something that would change the way she saw herself and the way others saw her. When she reached the threshold, she paused, her heart pounding. Beyond the door, she could see silhouettes waiting in the bright terminal light. One figure stood taller than the rest, his posture familiar even at a distance. Her breath caught, her chest constricted. For a moment, the world narrowed to a single thought. Daddy! And then she stepped forward. The brightness of the terminal light struck Aaliyah as she stepped out of the plane. Her eyes blinked rapidly, adjusting from the soft glow of the cabin to the stark fluorescence of the gate. For a moment, she hesitated at the threshold, her hand brushing the cool edge of the doorway. The terminal was quiet in a way she had not expected. Most late-night flights came with bustling crowds, rushing footsteps, voices echoing against tiled walls. But here, it felt as though the world had paused, holding its breath. Then she saw him. Marcus Carter stood at the center of the waiting area, tall and commanding, dressed in a sharp suit that carried the weight of authority. His face was set in a firm line, but when his eyes found Aaliyah, the expression softened instantly. Relief, love, and quiet fury flickered in his gaze all at once. Daddy, Aaliyah whispered, her voice breaking. She moved quickly down the jet bridge, the blanket slipping from her shoulders, hope still tucked in her pocket. Marcus stepped forward and caught her in his arms, pulling her close. She buried her face in his chest, the familiar scent of his cologne wrapping around her like a shield. For a long moment, nothing else mattered. The terminal, the passengers lingering behind, the crew watching carefully, everything fell away as father and daughter held on to each other. I'm here, Marcus murmured into her hair. I've got you, baby girl. You're safe. Her shoulders shook as tears slipped down her cheeks. But they weren't only from fear. They were from the release of finally being seen, finally being shielded. When he pulled back, His eyes found Daniel standing just a step behind her. Marcus extended a hand. "You must be the man who stood by my daughter tonight." "Thank you." Daniel shook his hand firmly. "She's remarkable. Anyone with eyes could see that. It was an honor to sit beside her." Marcus's jaw tightened slightly, his gratitude real, but his anger simmering just below the surface. His gaze shifted toward the plane's doorway, where Captain Harris now stood with a composed expression, hands folded behind his back. "Captain Harris," Marcus said evenly, his voice carrying authority that silenced the terminal. "Thank you for handling this with professionalism." Harris inclined his head. "Sir, I did my duty. No passenger should ever feel mistreated on my aircraft." Rebecca emerged from the cabin then, her movements slow, hesitant. Her face was pale, her eyes darting nervously between Marcus and the captain. She tried to stand tall, but her shoulders slumped ever so slightly under the weight of the stairs. The passengers who had supported Aaliyah lingered nearby, unwilling to leave. The man in 4C crossed his arms, watching intently. The woman in 2A stood closer, her eyes sharp, as though ready to speak if the truth was twisted. Marcus's gaze landed on Rebecca. Silence fell heavier than before. His voice, when he spoke, was calm but razor-sharp. "Miss Collins, do you know who I am?" Rebecca swallowed, her throat bobbing visibly. "You're her father," she said, her voice wavering. "That's true," Marcus said, "but I am also the chief operating officer of this airline. Every plane, every crew member, every passenger falls under my responsibility. And tonight, my responsibility was my daughter." Gas rippled through the passengers. Even Daniel's eyes widened slightly. The woman in 2A murmured, "I knew it was bigger than it looked." Rebecca's face drained of color. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, struggling for words. Marcus stepped closer, his voice steady but unyielding. "You denied a child basic kindness. You singled her out in front of a cabin full of witnesses. And when called to account, you offered not sincerity but deflection. Tell me, Miss Collins, is that what this airline stands for?" Rebecca's lips trembled. "No, sir. It was a mistake. A lapse in judgment." Marcus's eyes narrowed slightly. "A mistake is spilling a drink. A mistake is forgetting an order. What you did was a choice, and choices have consequences." Her shoulders sagged, the weight of his words pressing her down. She lowered her eyes, unable to hold his gaze. The other attendant beside her shifted uncomfortably, her expression apologetic as she glanced at Aaliyah. It was clear not everyone on the crew shared Rebecca's cruelty. Captain Harris spoke then, his voice calm but firm. "Mr. Carter, I've already filed a report with operations, but I defer to you for the final decision." Marcus nodded once, his hand resting gently on Aaliyah's shoulder. "There will be a hearing, and she will answer for this in full. Not just for Aaliyah, but for every passenger she disrespected by betraying her duty." The passengers murmured in agreement. The man in 4C spoke loudly enough for all to hear. "Good. Accountability matters." Rebecca's eyes flicked around the terminal, searching for an escape. But there was none. She gave the smallest nod, her voice barely audible. "Yes, sir." Marcus turned back to his daughter, his expression softening instantly. He knelt slightly, his hands resting gently on her shoulders. "Are you all right?" Baby Aaliyah sniffled, nodding. "I think so. I was scared, but people helped me." She looked briefly toward Daniel, then toward the passengers who had spoken up. Her voice grew stronger. "I wasn't alone." Marcus's eyes grew moist, though he held them steady. "You were never alone, and you never will be. You did nothing wrong. Don't ever let anyone make you doubt that." She nodded again, her chest swelling with something she hadn't felt since the moment the blanket was denied pride. Daniel stepped closer, his voice calm. "Mr. Carter, if I may, I think your daughter showed more composure tonight than most adults would have." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't retaliate. She simply asked for dignity. That deserves recognition. Marcus looked at Daniel, then back at his daughter, his voice thick with emotion. "She's her mother's child. Strong, graceful under fire." He pressed a kiss to her forehead. The passengers began to disperse slowly, but not before several offered final words of encouragement. "Stay strong. You're brave. We've got your back." Their voices carried like a chorus, wrapping around Aaliyah in a blanket of solidarity stronger than any the airline could provide. Rebecca remained silent, her figure shrinking as she retreated with the other attendant toward the far end of the terminal. The weight of shame clung to her like a shadow. Marcus straightened, his arm protectively around his daughter. "Come on, baby girl. Let's go home." As they walked together through the terminal, Daniel trailing just behind, Aaliyah felt a shift inside her. The fear was still there, the memory of humiliation still sharp, but it no longer defined her. What defined her now was the truth spoken aloud, the solidarity shown, the love that had met her at the gate. She touched the little robot in her pocket and whispered softly, "We made it." The walk through the terminal felt endless, though Marcus's steady hand on Aaliyah's shoulder kept her anchored. The lights were bright, the polished floors gleamed, and the few travelers lingering at that late hour turned their heads as they passed. It was not unusual to see a father and daughter walking side by side, but something about the way Marcus carried himself, something about the way Aaliyah leaned into him, caught attention. People could feel that something larger had just taken place. Daniel followed a few paces behind, his briefcase in hand, but his eyes always scanning, making sure Aaliyah was steady. His quiet loyalty filled the spaces where silence might otherwise have felt heavy. When they reached the security doors leading out of the terminal, Marcus slowed and guided Aaliyah to a bench tucked against the wall. He crouched down, looking her directly in the eyes. "Before we go any farther," he said gently, "I want you to hear this from me, not from the whispers around you. What happened tonight will not disappear. It will become a case study, a lesson, maybe even a headline. And people will want to ask you questions. They'll want to know how you felt. But remember this, your truth is not for them to twist. It belongs to you. You choose how to share it." Aaliyah nodded slowly, her fingers fidgeting with hope in her pocket. She understood more than he realized. For the first time, she felt the weight of being seen not just as a girl, but as a symbol of something bigger, something people would talk about. That thought both scared her and filled her with a quiet pride. Daniel stepped closer, speaking softly. "She's stronger than you think. Mr. Carter, I saw it in the way she carried herself tonight. She has a gift for staying calm under pressure. That's rare, even in adults." Marcus gave him a small smile. "I know. She gets that from her mother." His eyes softened as he looked back at his daughter. "And she gets her fire from me?" Aaliyah couldn't help but smile faintly at that, even as tears threatened again. Passengers who had supported her earlier began to emerge from the gate area, heading toward baggage claim. Several paused, offering one last wave or word of encouragement. The woman from 2A leaned down briefly, her voice warm. Don't let anyone dim your light. Sweetheart. The man from 4C gave a nod of respect to Marcus before adding, She's going to change things, sir. You can feel it. Marcus thanked them with a nod, gratitude in his eyes. He recognized that what had happened wasn't just his family's story anymore. It belonged to everyone who had witnessed it, and by extension, to everyone who had ever been made to feel small. The walk to baggage claim was quieter. Rebecca and the other attendant were nowhere to be seen. They had been escorted elsewhere. Captain Harris had stayed behind with the crew, his professionalism never wavering. But his last glance at Marcus had carried something like solidarity, as though both men understood the cost of leadership when justice was on the line. When they reached the carousel, Marcus guided Aaliyah to a quieter corner, away from the crowd. He pulled out his phone and made a brief call. His voice clipped and firm as he arranged for transport and signaled to colleagues that he would be handling the fallout personally. Aaliyah sat beside Daniel on the bench, her small frame leaning against the businessman's shoulder. "Do you think she'll lose her job?" Aaliyah asked quietly, her voice hesitant. Daniel considered the question. Actions have consequences, but losing a job isn't the point. The point is making sure what happened doesn't happen again. Sometimes accountability means removal. Sometimes it means change. Either way, it's about making things better, not just punishing someone. Aaliyah thought about that, her brow furrowed. "I just don't want anyone else to feel like I did tonight." Daniel nodded. "That right there is why you're stronger than most. You're already thinking beyond yourself." Marcus ended his call and sat down on Aaliyah's other side, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "Your friend is right. What happened tonight will be used to change policies, to train crews, to remind every person in this company that dignity is not negotiable." She leaned against him, breathing a little easier. The words settled into her like a promise, not just for herself but for others. As the luggage carousel groaned to life, Marcus turned to Daniel. "I owe you a debt for standing by her tonight. Most men would have kept quiet, but you didn't." Daniel shook his head. "No debt. We're all responsible for speaking up when something is wrong. Tonight it just happened to be me in that seat." He paused, then added, "Though I'll admit, she made it easy to care. She reminds me of my own daughter." Marcus's gaze softened. "Then you understand why this matters so much." The three sat in quiet companionship as bags began to circle. Passengers claimed their luggage, conversations echoing faintly, but Aaliyah barely noticed. She was lost in her thoughts, replaying the night like a film reel. The denial, the shame, the solidarity, the voice of the captain, the weight of her father's embrace. Every piece of it was stitched into her now, a story she would carry forever. When their bags arrived, Marcus collected them quickly. A car waited outside, and together they stepped into the cool night air. The city lights sparkled against the dark sky, planes still rising and descending in the distance. Inside the car, Aaliyah leaned against her father, the hum of the engine soothing. She whispered softly, almost to herself, "It still hurts." Marcus kissed the top of her head. "I know, baby, and it might for a while, but one day that hurt will turn into strength. And when it does, no one will ever take it from you." She closed her eyes, letting his words settle into her heart. She thought of the passengers who had spoken up, of Daniel who had stood firm, of the captain who had made sure her voice carried all the way to the ground. Maybe, just maybe, the world could change. As the car pulled onto the highway, Marcus looked out at the city skyline. his jaw set. He knew the days ahead would bring meetings, hearings, media inquiries. He knew the airline's reputation would be tested. But none of that weighed heavier than the single truth that guided him. Now his daughter had been wronged, and he would make sure justice was done. Aaliyah drifted toward sleep, her small hand still wrapped around Hope, the little robot that had endured the night with her. In her dreams, she walked through a terminal filled not with stares of suspicion, but with faces of kindness. Strangers offering blankets without hesitation, attendants smiling with genuine warmth. For the first time since boarding that plane, peace settled over her. And for Marcus, watching her sleep, peace came not from the quiet night, but from knowing that his daughter's courage had lit a fire that no one could put out. The night that had begun in humiliation had ended in justice, and from that justice, change would come. And so the night ended, not with silence, but with justice. What began as an act of quiet cruelty became a moment that revealed both the ugliest and the most beautiful parts of humanity. Aaliyah's strength reminded us that dignity is not a privilege, it is a right. Her father's presence reminded us that true power is not in titles, but in standing up when others remain quiet. And the voices of ordinary passengers proved that change begins when people refuse to look away. But let us not forget the lesson this flight has left behind. Racism and discrimination do not vanish because we choose to ignore them. They live in small moments, in careless words, in choices that wound, and they can only be defeated when confronted head-on with empathy, with courage, with unity. The story of Aaliyah is more than one child's experience. It is a mirror held up to us all, asking when the time comes, will we speak or will we remain silent? If this story touched your heart, help us spread its message. Like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Let us keep telling stories that challenge, inspire, and remind us of the humanity we all share.